Okay, and we are now live here on the Game of Stones Facebook page. Very excited to welcome in our guest today, someone who I've been working with a little bit over the past year. We'll get into that. But Ornella Nzindukiyimana joining us from Human Kinetics at St. FX. First of all, I hope I got that right. Second of all, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
No, thanks for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to speak. So yeah.
So I'll just say off the top that I work at Parks Canada. I was working on a designation of Larry Gaines, and that is a designation that was announced a few weeks ago. Would not have happened without your help in making sure everything was together in the right way, and that factually I got things right, because Larry Gaines is someone who you have written about in your work, and in general, your area of study is sport, culture, particularly with respect to the Black Canadian experience in the first half of the 20th century. So broadly speaking, how do you describe your work? Because I view you sort of in the foot of a historian. You know, you're walking in those footsteps, but you work in human kinetics. So how do you frame your own area of study and expertise?
Yes, so that's the thing. I'm not necessarily, I don't come from a history department. I kind of never set foot in a history department and ended up in history almost by accident, by doing a project at the end of my human kinetics degree, and then that led to a master's and then a PhD, but still all of those, I was in the School of Human Kinetics, or whatever it was called at the institutions I was at. So as you mentioned, it's that social cultural branch of human kinetics, which often in human kinetics departments is always sort of this little secluded place that straddles arts and science. So it's really, so I teach a lot of human kinetics students who are often Bachelor of Science students, specializing in human kinetics, and they come in, they're not sociology majors, they're not arts majors, they're not history majors, and it's really about sort of, if we look at them as this contingent of people that will be going on to be involved in sport in whatever capacity, whether as phys ed students, teachers, or professionals in sport in some ways, physical therapists, or OT, occupational therapists, and all of those things that human kinetics can lead to. It's about sort of impressing upon them how much sport, which is what I focus on. Some other people will focus on more like physical activity or more leisure, which are very separate things. So my interest is more sport, so that competitive element, organized element, and it's about impressing upon them the place that sport has in society, in our society, in North American and global society as a whole. So it's very much based upon that idea that sport plays an important part in shaping what we end up thinking about, thinking of as being Canadian life or Canadian identity, and all the other parts of identity as well. So gender, race, class, ethnicity, and all those parts and how they intersect as seen through the lens of sport. So yeah, it does always seem a bit, I always have to convince, I suppose, my students, because often people in human kinetics are people who have had great experiences with sport, right? They've played sport, they love it, they want to continue working in it, and whether competitive or just people like me who have always been sort of attracted to sport and just enjoyed the phenomenon that is sport. And so it's about convincing them that not everything is great about it, that there are many issues through that develop through sport, that yes, sport can be this great medium where great things can happen, but on the other side as well, it brings about its own issues. Yeah, so that kind of, I hope, summarizes that question, that the answer to that question, which is, yes, it's important, I think, especially in a university. It's about giving students that balanced view, instead of just seeing the body as this machine, which is what they learn in biomechanic classes and all those. It's about sort of bringing it back and saying, the way we treat the body in this view of the body through the medical lens is partly what's the issue here, because we forget that it is anchored in a social cultural context that makes it problematic if we forget about it.
Right. So let's get into some of that side of it, because a lot of the opposition or criticism that I've heard over the past week, and really the past few years, about athletes taking political stances or social justice stances has been, just play the game, right? Sports should be free of these sorts of things. And so I wrote down, just off the top of my head today, a bunch of names of people: Jack Johnson, Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Tommy Smith, John Carlos. Those were just off the top of my head in 5 seconds that I could think of. Athletes whose significance went well beyond the results in whatever their field was. You also have the 1980 Winter Olympic hockey team, the Americans, the Miracle on Ice team, the Summit Series in this country, the Winnipeg Falcons, the Edmonton Grads, and certainly you can go on and on with teams that their significance goes well beyond the accomplishment exclusively in terms of the result of the sport. So why do you think there is this perception that so much of sport history was devoid of these things, when clearly your work, amongst a lot of other things, demonstrates that that is not the case? Like, where does this narrative come from that sports in the past was somehow neutral?
When it's presented, when it starts, right? You begin sport as this. It's presented as this arena of this equalizing force. Everybody's on the same exact level, and only their effort and only their talent and skill and athleticism can separate them. And all of that is very individual and very much devoid, seemingly, of any kind of outside influence. Things we try to call, we generally call politics. And so, it is such a great idea to have a space where all of those things are stripped down, and a person is only defined by the effort they put in and this performance they can give, and you can put a number to it. They ran this fast, they jumped this high, marked put in so many points. But so all of that obscures, when you go back to the origins of sport, of organized sport, of modern sport at the turn of the 20th century, with the elite men's clubs organizing these things, they set up that template, and they kind of simulated that notion, so that once other people actually started coming in, we continued to believe that this was the case, that it was devoid of any of the taint of outside. But also, it does have to do with the fact that when you look at those names, like Jesse Owens was not speaking out, the way Colin Kaepernick is speaking out, or the way John Carlos and Tommy Smith spoke out, right? They did not. Actually, Jesse Owens is said to have been very much anti the 1968 demonstration by Tommy Jones and Tommy Smith and John Carlos. He was very much about do what you have to do on the field and don't speak up. Almost as if, your performance should speak for itself. But at that point in time, the whole idea of just standing and letting your performance speak was past. It was great in 1936 when just showing up and racking up a bunch of medals and putting to shame the whole ideology, the whole Nazi ideology without speaking a word was just very much very powerful. But by 1968, that is past. We've seen it, that moment had passed, but he was insisting, he was very anti-political, politicizing sport, when sport is already politicized. Not everybody can access it. There are several rules, and we seem to be very much okay with politics when the majority or the elite are benefiting from it. Those people who say separate sport from politics are the ones who are very much okay with the the series, the Summit Series in '72, and this clash on ice against the Soviets. Like, that was not a hockey game. That was a Cold War, battle. It was very much a high stakes, and those hockey players discovered that very quickly, game one, when they lost, and just realized that the crowd was not about this. Like, they were not there to be entertained. They were there to crush the Soviets. In that case, nobody was saying, no, remove the politics. I just want entertainment. I want something to make me forget about life, and just kind of this escapism somehow seems to come in when whatever is being espoused, whatever is being endorsed by the athletes, it goes against whatever ideology you hold. So it's been interesting to watch the American president's son-in-law criticizing the NBA and the president. I believe I just kind of avoid anything trying to do any direct contact with his aura, but at the same time, you see that somehow that is wrong, because, well, of course it is against you, so you're going to find a way to crush that. But it's fine if they go and represent how the U.S. is great at the Olympics or what have you, and stand for the flag, and so it's very hypocritical.
Right. Well, I think immediately of Muhammad Ali, right? When he wins the gold medal at the Olympics as Cassius Clay, and he's sort of this national hero, and then changes his name. He's Muhammad Ali. He throws the medal into the river in Louisville, and he is openly critical of the Vietnam War, and then he becomes this villain, and it's really, he's the same guy. It's just sort of what he is publicly standing for that has changed. So it seems to me a lot of the times it's not so much people are saying keep politics out of sports or stick to sports. It's kind of more along the lines of stick to my politics. What I support, what I'm interested in. And that's where people then they say, well, sports didn't used to be like this. Well, no, it did always kind of used to be like this. And it's also a way that people have been governed, right? Both physically and maybe even culturally a little bit, is through sports, is by putting people or encouraging people to participate in sports. I think of after the First World War, when governments were encouraging people to participate in sports, particularly in schools, because, hey, if there's another war, we need people who are in shape. Right?
Yes.
Sports is the avenue to try to keep people physically active and in shape. So that's a direct political use of sport right there.
Exactly. When the state is employing it very, very blatantly, it seems to be forgotten. And so I would be interested to see, because that's the thing, we saw that a lot in early in the 20th century, where sport was really pushed as this thing to help maintain the strength of, especially when thinking with Canada and the empire and everything, the whole, protecting the empire. But it would be interesting to see how it would be received today, because there's a lot of, anti-state control people and movements. And so would that be seen as an imposition, or would that be seen as a, oh, well, yeah, it's sport, it's okay, it's they're looking out for us type of, attitude? It would be interesting to see.
I think, if you think back to Michelle Obama had her Let's Move campaign and encouraged people to eat vegetables, and she got heavily criticized for that from some corners, right? For those things that you're talking about. I do want to ask, though, that in the list of people who I immediately came up with that were immediately in front of mind, with the exception of the Edmonton grads, they were all men. And, there certainly is a gender element to it. So I tried to think a little deeper, and the names that came to my mind were people like Jackie Joyner-Kersee, or even maybe Cheryl Miller, as women who fit into this mold. But in general, what is the difference, do you think, between men who have been more active or activist within sports and women?
If I think there's something to say about the just the reach and the platform that they hold, right? When you're looking at, whatever the men do will have a lot of repercussions, because there's just a big following, and often they're the first ones sort of out, and they're just, they have greater significance in popular culture. And women, given just the space that the little space that they are given in sport, whatever they do seems, even though by stepping out and by speaking out and by actually making, taking a stance, they're risking much more than men, because often they're paid less, they have less opportunities, and so on and so forth. It just seems to not make as much of an impact, and it is unfortunate. But the devaluation of women's sport, I think, contributes a lot to just the dismissal of whatever they may be able to say. And historically, we've had very few women who have had such, who have been able to stand at such a, on such a platform as some of the men we've seen. So, thinking back, maybe Althea, I think Gibson, tennis player, she won Wimbledon. She was very much a representative of this rising Black middle class, and was politicized, and definitely had a lot of backing to kind of step out and speak out. But very few people would name her, would remember her, when you have people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Muhammad Ali or Bill, what's his name, Arthur Ashe. She just somehow kind of just blended in. Maybe if she had come after Ashe instead. No, I think actually Ashe came after her, but still kind of eclipsed her. And so when you have that going on, I think just the platform that is given to women is so small that whatever they say, it's almost like they're screaming into the void. And unless men come in and lend their support, it just doesn't seem that the spotlight stays even, on them, if it did even kind of turn to them. We see that with the WNBA. They made strong statements early on when Colin Kaepernick first started, and that sort of movement, and even before he kind of left the NFL and so on. But somehow the NBA does something, and they are, it becomes much bigger thing than them, even though, the WNBA has been sort of on that line for a longer time. The NBA before this had only done, they had done T-shirts. LeBron James and a few others had spoken up, but before 2020, they didn't have as much of an involvement as the WNBA people and athletes. But yet, it just seems like the NBA is the leader of this movement at this point in time. WNBA just kind of forgotten.
Yeah, and certainly the WNBA players are, I think, even more pointed too in the discussions of these issues. I think particularly about the women on the Atlanta team, who are very, very direct in their criticism of the owner, for instance, who's a senator, an American senator. Right there is a little more willingness to be open and direct in their criticisms, and some of the NBA guys do seem to cash it a little more than the women in the WNBA. And you see it, I think of people on the American national women's soccer team as well.
Yes.
People like Megan Rapinoe, who are very open and clear about where they stand on issues, where you don't really hear from the men's Olympic soccer team in the United States at all on these types of issues, even though they get paid more for poor performances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah. So you've written an article about the lack of historical resources available for people who want to look into the story or the history of Black women. So the article we played ball just the same, which came out recently. So it's about recollections of Black women's experiences in sport. And basically what I got from the article is this idea that, and it's something that I've been wrestling with in some of my other work, is, how biased are archives on just self-selection, right? And what people have deemed important enough to put down. So for you, how do we try to account for the lack of resources and the bias that is just inherent within any sort of repository based on who made the decision to keep stuff and not to keep?
Wow, it is very, that's a big,
I know that might be an unfair big question.
Oh no, I mean, it is a very much a letdown when you go to archives and you find a lot missing on many groups of people. And luckily for Ontario, at least when I was doing my research, there was the Ontario, the Multicultural Historical MHS Society of Ontario, and what I was able to write in that article was based on the work that they did back in the 80s and 90s, interviewing people from back then and kind of collecting these stories. And so it's about that. It's about sort of like any kind of attempt at repairing this imbalance in any field, or they're talking about who's around tables and who's contributing to narratives and who's making the decisions and has influence. It's about ensuring and being very pointed about it and being very purposeful about it. That Multicultural Historical Society of Ontario collection was gathered purposefully. They targeted specific groups. In that they have Black Canadians, but they have men and women. They had a good mix of both. But they also, that it contains just a whole host of interviews from, Jewish people and Ukrainian immigrants, and, all just a whole host of different groups that are just, have historically just kind of led their lives outside of the mainstream and have never necessarily done big things, so that the big repositories and archives have been interested in sort of getting their things and collecting their things. So it's about sort of that purposeful collection and not just waiting for but while sitting around and kind of waiting for this sort of natural process through which collections are made, which is donations by certain people who know that this happens, or reliance on hard physical archives as well, and written accounts. Because part of the reason why we miss a lot of narratives from certain groups is because they were not reliant on they didn't write diaries and collect a bunch of records in that way about themselves. They were more orally based and passed down their stories that way. And so if the main archives sort of rely on, oh well, we'll get what we get from everyone else, which is those diaries and those photographs and all of that, then it kind of completely raises a whole group of people that doesn't have that as their main way of communicating down, through generations. So it needs to be there has to be a purposeful collection of archives from from communities, more specifically, and hopefully, I mean, I don't know what's going on in that area, whether there's been any awakening to this, and whether that process has started. I know that I'm planning of almost doing the same thing from that article here in Nova Scotia. And I know that I haven't stumbled on any of those great oral histories from the same kind of thing that I found in Ontario. So I'll have to be basically knocking on doors and seeing what people have in their attics about their grandfathers and grandmothers, and personal family archives, and then eventually down the road collecting those oral histories myself, because there's just I thought Ontario was bad. Nova Scotia and just the Maritimes is even worse. There's really very little on the communities that have been here for hundreds of years. So yes, it's a bit, it's discouraging, but I think it can still, there's a lot there can still be a lot salvaged. And, if we can speak to people fast enough and collect those memories while they're still around, we can make sure not to have a big gap, because right now it's widening, right?
Right. Have you noticed a difference in the way that people express themselves through these, or just describe family members who are part of the Black community, versus the way, say, newspaper writers would write about Black athletes through the 20th century? Like, I'm trying to think if there are terms that might have been used, given that a lot of writers were looking at athletes through a racialized lens. So when you go into an archive or you're doing research, what is the difference between the way people would self-describe or family members would describe them versus the way a newspaper writer or magazine writer would describe a Black athlete?
It's always, so Canadians were often very very polite about it. There was at least up until the 1950s, there was a marked just trend of making sure you point out that this person is, this was a Negro athlete, or another term they used was dusky. dusky athletes and or ebony. Well, no, ebony was not used a lot in the mid-century. More like I think like earlier. So there was just a way of labeling them consistently. Somehow that way, despite not using a lot of pictures the way you would now, you still knew who was black and who was white, because if you looked up the sports pages enough, you would find that that they were labeled as such. Whereas obviously the other athletes were just John Smith did that, and that was period. And then that John Smith cannot be anything other than white. So there was a lot of that labeling that, obviously when people are talking about family members or themselves, they're not sort of going around doing. In terms of, in terms of a way to separate and really establish that there's something different about these athletes, these Negro athletes or dusky athletes, often there was, when they were Canadians, they seemed to be a bit more clement than when they were Americans. That's something I found, where just when it was, I don't know if it was this patriotic thing coming out where you wanted to kind of embrace at least these Canadians because, hey, they were on your side. But when they're Americans, there could be sometimes a bit more of a, oh, look, these strong types and that kind of, the athletic built, and just that animalistic tendencies and or that animalistic kind of the theme, that being sort of the theme of how you describe these athletes, how a bit unnatural they may be, but there was not a lot. I'm actually sort of working on trying to see to purposefully analyze that and look at the language that was used. But Canadians were very careful in the way they really did things. I've found in when I was researching and going through many Globe and Mail or Star or whatever other mainstream media, it was often quite subtle. Though sometimes he just went ahead and said, boom, there's just a wave of black athletes, and clearly we can defeat them because, hey, they're black. Maclean's was, I think there's a difference also in that Maclean's or magazines and newspapers, because then in Maclean's it's more of a commentary and less of a report. And so there's more space to then go on a tangent about how these black athletes are good because they're black.
Right. So, I'm thinking too in the lens of the Larry Gain paper and subsequent designation, where in the English context, he wasn't allowed to fight for the English heavyweight championship, even though he would have qualified based off of all the rules, in part because of this idea in England that if a black boxer is the English champion, it somehow diminishes the white Englishman and is almost emasculating for them. And it's larger concerns about how do we keep control of our colonies if it's not this white man who is, at the time when the heavyweight champion was the toughest person in the world, if it's man, how do we continue to control these colonies? And it seems to me like in those cases, the description of black fighters, at least, would be more that they're more ruthless or more violent or more cunning or underhanded in some way. And
more destructible, and it's unfair and all that.
Yeah, and it's that type of almost coded language that is used to minimize their agency as athletes, even though on a even scale they might be better. It gets presented as unfair or somehow that they're not worthy of the accolades that they've earned.
Yeah, that's the thing. with Larry Gaines, it was just fascinating because I mean, it always seemed to me that there was Jack Johnson and then Lewis, and then sort of in the middle, nothing happening. But when I went in and found Larry Gaines sort of somewhere in that middle and sort of hustling and trying to get somewhere and sort of chipping at the block that eventually Lewis breaks through, it does seem that it does make more sense that some athletes before Lewis helped chip that block, and that Lewis was not just this sudden arrival on a stage where everybody's like, okay, now this was silly. It was perceived as silly earlier on the way, until Lewis eventually, sort of benefited, sort of stood on the shoulders of people like Gaines and other athletes that were in between. So it was exactly interesting because Canadians, I think once again, that whole nationalism, patriotism thing very much was in play because they were very vocal about how, well, clearly there was some hypocritical thing going on with England and the fact that he was also not allowed for the main heavyweight championship. And that discourse was there that, hey, we know the reason why, we understand the reason why he's not being given a chance. It was just such an open secret that there was almost no need to really spend too much time on it, right? But at the same time, it didn't mean that, there's some scholars, have spoken about it, just that support doesn't necessarily mean much when you consider how it also does play into a need to control the Black athlete. So it's not so much that they think Gaines is completely equal. It's more like he's ours. If when he wins, it'll be our flag that will go up, and we have ownership of him. And I mean, so far so good, right? He's good, and we'll drop him if he messes up. But so far he's playing into our hands, so of course we're going to support him. I mean, it comes back again to that discussion we were having about how the president and the right is reacting to the protests about the athletes. They're perfectly fine going to support them and filling up those arenas when they're just playing, when they're in control of what they're doing. But as soon as they seem to get out of those bounds, then you hit the brakes and say, no, this let's not get overexcited here. Nobody ever said that you were on the same level as us, right? So there's sort of that backup. And I think that's what Gaines was, is that it does seem he's well taken care of and Canadians love him. But, it's history tells us that was really, thankfully, because he was great and he was, he didn't mess up, and he fit a good mold.
Right. Well, during his career, right? I wonder too, after his career, he runs into some legal troubles, and then his memory is basically gone, right? And I do wonder how much of that post-career challenges that he suffered, some of it self-inflicted. He was a gambler, and in his memoir, he's very open about his just love of gambling, which didn't help his finances. But when you have those sorts of things where the memory of him is largely erased from contemporary Canada, I do wonder if how much of what his post-career boxing career life was like influences that. And it leads me to the larger question about the idea of nationalism and patriotism for Canada and sports, because so much of it comes from hockey. In this country, right? Hockey is kind of the central thing that in theory unites everybody. And yet, as we've seen over the past few weeks and months, as the NHL has started to delve into some of these social justice issues as well, it is very much a white sport. There's not a lot of diversity within the sport. I think there's more than a lot of people might think. You know, we've seen minority athletes from the NHL have a platform recently, and I'm always kind of surprised on Twitter where the reaction is, I didn't realize there was black athletes or black hockey players in the National Hockey League.
Mhm.
So what do you like? Does that tell us anything? The fact that hockey holds this place in Canadian culture, such a strong place, and yet it doesn't reflect. And I've said this about curling as well, that when I go to a curling club, it doesn't look like the country that I walk around in every day, right? I don't see the same faces that I see when I'm walking around downtown Ottawa when I go into the curling club. I think the same was true as my experience growing up, going to hockey arenas as well. It didn't reflect, I mean, it reflected the town I lived in, because, you know, I lived in a very white suburb, but, you know, it was close to Toronto. So when I would go into Toronto, go to Blue Jay games or whatever, I wasn't seeing the same faces when I went to the hockey arena. So what does it tell us that this gets held up so much? The sport gets held up in the popular imagination of Canada, and yet it either explicitly or implicitly excludes so many people who live in this country and are Canadian.
Yeah, I think it speaks a lot to when you look at the work that's been done. It seems to be that there's, you know, these other people are allowed to contribute to that nationalism and identity and so on, sort of for a moment, for specific purposes within specific parameters, and then we move on to the regular programming, which is hockey and whiteness and that anchored, you know, European British legacy, white European British legacy that we just cannot shake. So when you're looking at, and I suppose it goes back to why then people like Larry Gaines somehow disappear, despite having been some of the biggest names during that period of time, that short period of time. Or I recently stumbled on another fighter who was who seems to have broken the color bar for what is it, the second level of so not heavyweight, maybe lightweight in Canada. No, not lightweight. What comes down?
Is there there's bantamweight, flyweights?
Yeah, I think it was one of those. I think it was bantam, but I have to recheck.
Are you talking about George Godfrey by chance?
No, he came in. When does he come? He comes in the 40s, and he's the first Black athlete to break into who to win the title, the Canadian title for that weight, and somehow just kind of, you know, just slips out of the consciousness. Actually, really, even when he was holding the title, it just seems everybody ignored him. Even, I mean, I stumbled on him through a Black newspaper from Nova Scotia, which was very much too focused on people like Jackie Robinson at the time and Joe Louis to notice someone like that other man whose name, ironically, but I'm really bad with names, but whose name ironically is also escaping me. But so, yes, there's just, the trend has been that these athletes can be upheld for a second to fulfill a specific purpose, but they're not who we truly are. Who we truly are is hockey, and in that spirit, it needs to be protected. It is quite well protected and kept well within the you know, certain quarters and between certain people, and others just never really find a space in it. When you look at, you've had athletes through which Canada has happily vicariously lived through, who are not white, you know, through the times, but they had to be perfect right? And whenever they were not, or whenever it appeared that they were overstepping their bounds and becoming too much of an agent, they were dropped like very hot potatoes. It just never, you have to be very perfect, or even if you're really good, it's really hard to get a grasp and stay and have any staying power, it seems, as an athlete of color in a country, whereas just hockey has been baked in and just stays and keeps on giving. And the others may help a little bit with when we need to be reassured that the whole multiculturalism thing is real and that it works. The Raptors and We the North have been that, they've helped that. But, I'm a big fan of the Raptors, but I'm very, completely skeptical about what they represent and this notion that wants to, this movement that wants to make us believe that they are that they somehow represent Canada and that they are embraced at, coast to coast to coast. It's quite superficial, and I doubt that basketball hoops are going to replace hockey rinks in small communities across the country. So hockey just has had such staying power because it obviously was, anchored much earlier. And then you had that period of time where it was really the only thing around. Hockey Night in Canada, on radios, on TVs, this was the only thing that generations absorbed. And it's just impossible, after they've absorbed the image of hockey as it was in 1906, to change it apparently right now. In 2020, it's just still very much that same image. We seem to visualize a difference or any challenge to it as somehow, a challenge to Canada and Canadian identity and everything that Canada, everything good that Canada stands for.
Well, how much do people like Georges Laraque or Anson Carter play in this sort of thing in terms of just representation and seeing things? Like I know that when I was a kid, I could turn on Hockey Night in Canada, not only see people who looked like me, I could see people from my town, right? Like we had somebody from our town who played in the NHL, so I could literally turn on the TV and see somebody who grew up in the same place as me, who shared so much of my experience. So, how much of just seeing people who represent you, whether it's geographically, ethnically, linguistically. I think in this country there are certain sports that have a pretty big linguistic divide as well. How much is that representation at the highest level of sport influential in shaping not only what the sport is, but also the way in which communities come together and perceive each other across the country?
I think it has a lot of, it has some power, I think, to be able to turn in and see someone. But at the same time, when you have just a drop, one player here, one player there, I don't think it makes much of, it almost becomes the exception that proves the rule. The rule being, we don't play that sport. And those are just these outliers that somehow ended up in the sport. And that people can't see themselves through. And it doesn't help that often those athletes, hockey being hockey, there's little support for any kind of outspoken nature, right? Any kind of personality, to be honest. And so it doesn't help that, as you were saying, most people don't even realize they exist because they just go, they play, they blend in their, that locker room and just, have their head down, focused on hockey. And it's not like they're going into communities and impressing upon them that, hey, I did it, you can do it. When you have some kid who really somehow tunes into hockey and becomes very much focuses on somehow succeeding into it, they may see them and decide to lock onto them as someone who they can emulate. But on a greater scale, I don't think they make much of an impact, because just being there and in a sea of white faces doesn't seem to produce much of an impact. We've had a few athletes over the years, since the days of, say, I don't know, Jeremy Ginla early on, and still it doesn't seem to have produced much of a movement after them saying, oh my gosh, I saw that I can do that. Because hockey, in addition to, of course, being hostile to certain groups, it's just expensive and getting more and more expensive. And these days you have like, these, what do you call them? These hockey training programs and that just require a lot of resources. And it just so happens that those groups that are not white are unlikely to be able to access them. So when you add that layer, it just becomes very difficult, because it takes a lot of energy for a kid to break through at the lower level, let alone, reaching that high level. It was at some point it looked like, hey, you had Subban, and he was quite, well, maybe not vocal in terms of on race, but he was very visible. He was very flamboyant, as they like to call him, and very much not a hockey guy. And you would think that his presence there being, could have had, but I'm not sure that anybody has traced some kind of surge thanks to him, despite how visible he was. Because once again, his presence and just the way he's been pushed to, he's been marginalized in that league, has made him more of, again, that exception that really proves the rule that, well, there's nothing for you there. You shouldn't really go there.
Right. Well, like I use the example on the show sometimes that at the curling club, at the Rideau Curling Club in Ottawa, a few years ago, I pointed out that one night I said, there's no black people here at the club. And somebody said, well, what about Jim? And Jim was the one black member of the club. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, okay, like doesn't that kind of prove that the lack of diversity here is that you immediately say, like, here's the one black, like, why do we do that as holding him up? And the other thing in terms of the comparison with, or the reference to PK Subban, I always felt a lot of the criticism of him was really unfair in terms of style of play, because being here in Ottawa, I saw a lot of Erik Karlsson play, and they seem to play a very similar style of very open, offensive, aggressive games. And I never heard the same type of criticism of Erik Karlsson as I heard of PK Subban for playing what I felt were very similar styles of on-ice game. And so you think, why is there that criticism? Well,
yeah, he just couldn't fit in, right? And I think he just had the most unfortunate personality for a hockey player, and then happens to be black, and so whatever he does is timed 10. It's like, and then you also think the whole idea that we have as a society, just the majority of people have about sport being an equalizer, being a meritocracy, seems to feed into it as well. Because when they don't see people around, they're like, well, they're not playing, they're not good. It's not that the Leafs, it's not that we've done something somehow that has made it impossible for athletes of color, black athletes, to make it up to the top and possibly be part of the Leafs program. It's just that they're not good. Like,
Right.
They just somehow, they can't play. And then, if that's the logic, then there's nothing to do about it, right? Well, it's not a problem. They just need, if they were good, they would have been chosen. But they're just not there because of so many other different reasons, other than just they were not there to be chosen. And people get very upset and worked up about the notion that, well, if it's a whole white team, it means that they're doing something wrong. Because again, to them, it looks like, well, the Leafs just look for the best players, and the best players happen to be white. So get over it. And why should we worry about this? But the NBA is 80% Black, and no one is worrying about that. But actually, someone is worrying about that. But somehow, it's brought up only when that becomes an issue only when the other thing is challenged.
So let's get into this idea too of sort of how people get into the sport, because some of the pushback that has gone on over the past couple months from the curling community, and it's not just us on the show who've talked about the lack of diversity in the sport. A lot of people have said that the pushback has been that curlers aren't racist on average, and I believe that. I don't think curlers go to curl on their Wednesday night teams and are consciously say to them, I only want to play with white people. I'm sure there are a few, but I don't think the majority of the curling community actively thinks that. But at the same time, I do look around at the curling community and don't see, again, the country that I live in represented at the curling club. So in your experience and your research into sport, what can sports do at this grassroots level to make the spaces more welcoming, make them more inclusive, again, at the grassroots? Because eventually, at least in the case of curling, if grassroots curling becomes more diversified, then the elite level curling will as well. It sort of feeds from the bottom up, from the local level, will eventually get to the national level, particularly with junior programs, and making it so that more people are comfortable coming to the club, bringing kids to the club to get into the sport. So your experience in your research, what steps generally can sports take to make it more of a welcoming environment?
I suppose it's a host of things, but there has to be some kind of culture around the sport for people to feel like they can just walk in without being that one Black person, without being marked up. Because one thing, when you look at sports that somehow have ended up segregated by race or some other marker, it is usually because people then feel very comfortable in those spaces, and any external person, any other, just will have trouble fitting in without being reminded constantly that they are that exception, that they shouldn't be there, that somehow they're pioneering something. And most people never want to be that first Black person to step in, or the only, because it's very, research has shown, just sort of psychologically speaking, culturally speaking, nobody ever wants to be, to end up, being that one person in a group like that, in a society that is very conscious of race, even when it raises it or pretends that it doesn't mean anything, is very tiring for people. Being the only one there is very just emotionally draining. And so you'll have that one person coming in and then they leave. As long as they don't have a culture around them, as long as they're not sort of, that it's not something that other people, their entourage is doing, it becomes very difficult to make it stick and make it an actual habit instead of a one-time thing, an exceptional thing. So when you're looking at all the sports are segregated. People go there because that's where their uncle and their cousin is, their friends, and where they can feel comfortable, and they just avoid the others because it's just not worth the trouble. Why would you put yourself in that position for something that you're not necessarily even passionate about? So I think it starts with creating a culture at the very early stage where, if we're talking about curling, making it just open, and making it part of communities, making it making it casually something that's just there for everyone. But that takes, it's not something that's fixed, just in a snap. It takes time to really create a sense that people can actually participate in this thing. When you have that racial component, it becomes even more, because you have to break that tension that they can't, that on one side, white people have to accept that they can be in that space without somehow being intrusive or the exception or the special person that somehow can play the sport that we usually are the only ones being able to play. And on the other side, it needs, it has to be understood and built in, that it's a place I can walk in without feeling exposed and with a spotlight on me. So that cultural, just building that, I can't even name any kind of example where that has happened, where there's been a great shift in the perception of what an activity should be and who should be part of that activity. Because it's just, look at baseball. Despite, yes, it's, Jackie Robinson broke the gates, and you had people like, Campanella, and there's a few that followed right around his era, and great baseballers. But baseball didn't somehow become this big black sport. It is still, I suppose at this point you would say there's a lot of Latino people, it's a lot of white, and then a few black people. It's never taken off, despite the fact that actually by the time Jackie Robinson goes in it, it's a huge sport in the black community. They've gravitated towards other things. So you can have the stories, you can have the heroes, but just looking historically speaking, it takes much more than having, that one champion. It seems to take just a very long process to really switch it up. I suppose basketball is one that has switched up. Basketball started, in the YMCA's, and it was very much about white Christian men, and the NBA starts out very white, and then eventually there's a switch somewhere where it becomes read as urban and black, and white people just kind of self-select themselves outside of it. It becomes a thing that the others do, not something we do, and somehow it switches up. But that's the thing. Instead of actually creating a good mix, it's just displaced one group for another, right?
Right.
So we need a better model for sport that actually creates that vision you were saying, that you can walk into the room and look around and actually see the country, see people around the curling ice, the curling ice being the same exact people that you're finding, around Rito Center. But yeah, it seems it's very difficult without breaking a lot of barriers around just that we have, all the hang-ups that we have around racial identity and what people do, and that, associations between activities and certain groups. It just seems we cluster.
Right.
It's much easier.
Yeah. I think in the curling context, one of the things that we've talked about in one of our roundtables was, let's get rid of the word club, because most curling places, like where you go curl, they're called the curling club. Let's get rid of the word club and call them curling facilities, or even arenas, or something, curling centers. If you get rid of the word club, it might make it just feel more inclusive, right? Just the idea that this is a club, you have to be a member to come in. That, like, it's not really productive. Like, one of the clubs in this town, where in Ottawa, is in Chinatown. And right on the front door, it says private club members only. Like, that's not exactly the message I think you want to send to the local community around you. You want to be an inclusive, welcoming place. So that's just one small step that we came up with that maybe would be a start of the process.
I think it would have some effect, because yes, absolutely, club is synonymous with exclusivity and just somehow a higher class, and just many people don't see themselves in that word, in that idea. And I mean, that actually, as you were saying, club, I was thinking, if we're going to go with, hey, someone made it at the very top, why didn't they bring a bunch of people behind? Look at golf and Tiger Woods, and how, he's just pretty much the only one. I don't watch much golf, but I'm pretty sure there's not many in that following his footsteps. And some will say, well, it's just, they're not talented enough. But have we looked at how many are given the opportunity to start playing golf? And I believe it's very small. It's a certain demography that plays golf, and so the chances are greater that they're not going to show up and make it anywhere big, because they're just not given the opportunity. So yeah, club, that whole notion of club, we see it with swimming as well. Often that's a club sport. Tennis, those sports are very segregated, activities. I don't know if just the word without sort of the financial or the accessibility would work, because if still people can't kind of actually participate, then it wouldn't be very useful. But yeah, I think that is a great obstacle for many sports.
Yeah, and certainly I think, too, there's the economic side of it as well. That is sort of mentioned. Being a member of a club usually costs money, and if you look at the sports like curling, there's criticism within the curling community that some people think curling is too inexpensive for people to participate. I'm more on the other side, that I think it's kind of a little expensive, depending on where you live in the country. Varies. But hockey and golf, like, those are expensive expensive sports, whereas basketball, you hoop and a ball and a flat surface, and you can play it outside with not that much space. Soccer, same thing, right? You get a ball, people, you can play, and those things all are part of a larger process. So I know you have another meeting, and I want to make sure you get a good enough break before your next session. I don't want to take up all your time tonight, but
actually, before we kind of switch to the last topic, it's the last, I want to mention that there has been a historically, I don't know if it's still going on, but I know I read about it somewhere, this curling tradition. I think it was in the prairies between Japanese Canadians. There was something that was started sort of around, I believe, the Second World War, and where, it was within that community, curling was a huge deal, and it was sort of one of those things where everybody showed up, and it was very regular, and there was a big organized competition within that community. So it is possible for people to kind of adopt it, but in that case, once again, it was very much related to the community within itself. It wasn't sort of a thing that led to Japanese, Canadian champions at the highest level. It just seemed to be very contained. So, that adoption can be there. It can happen. It just seems to be that breaking that barrier and making it actually mix up people is a whole other ball game.
Yeah. I think the comparison, at least again in curling, that I would use that I think has been successful is with LGBTQ plus leagues that have started as sort of rainbow leagues in various cities across the country. And certainly in Ottawa here, the curling club where the league is hosted, members of that league play all week, right? So there's the set rainbow league, but those people who participate in that league have become members of all the leagues across the club. So I think that's an example where it has been a successful model where you've seen a great integration and a welcoming, open place for members of the LGBTQ plus community. Successful.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's that culture, right? Just creating a space and then kind of opening it up and then hoping that it catches on so that one kid that actually can make it to the highest level makes it and then continues. Yeah.
So the what I wanted to just sort of wrap up with for today is based on sort of where we've been with sports over the past, not just the past week, but everything associated with the return of the NBA, what the National Hockey League has done, the struggles that Major League Baseball has had with reckoning with these issues. They're the ones that are sort of front of mind, get the most press coverage at least. Where do you think we are with respect to sports and politics? Is there any chance that it goes back to where we were 5 years ago, where, right before Colin Kaepernick takes a knee, where, there is a political element to it, but it's not as overt and obvious to people as it is? We kind of open Pandora's box, and this is going to be some sort of wedge issue where it's going to be used for the way you mentioned the president uses it is sort of identity politics, and sports is now the focal point of it. Is this sort of the new normal for sports at a more prominent way than it ever used to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have opened that box. I think there's no way to go back, especially because what's so different with this moment is that for once there's actual support as the protest or stand is being made, or the protest is being orchestrated, that you didn't find necessarily back in the day, obviously even just 2 seconds ago with Kaepernick, or further back with the Muhammad Ali's of the world, where they were completely ostracized and then sort of raised up later when there was a reckoning and sort of a look back, hindsight, realization that, hey, maybe he was right, or had a point somewhere. What's different here is that there isn't that delay. The leagues, the stand that is being made is almost becoming just part of the part of the fabric. It's, hey, what could you have made a better, or how could you have played better? How could that play been better? And also, what else would you want to say about what's going on outside the bubble? Once the bubble kind of bursts and we go back to normal, if we ever do, I think it's going to be very difficult to go back and ask, or expect and make any kind of erasure of everything that's happened. Not when you have such vocal high-paid, prominent athletes consistently making that stand. So the opposition will have to get used to it, that you can just dribble. What is it? Dribble and play, or
shut up,
dribble. You know, that there's more to it. And I mean, when you look at the fact that the Olympics are limping so hard these days, and yet try to stand to hold on to this notion that they are neutral, and people, you know, it would have been interesting if this had happened and the Olympics had happened after they had, at this point, I believe athletes at the Olympics were supposed to be fined if they had made a stand. So it would have been interesting to see how that would have unfolded with, you know, everything that was everything happening now and so on, because effectively athletes are gagged right now. Olympians are gagged and can't technically say anything, or once they're on that stage. So given just the movements that are against this notion of neutral sport, that have made it clearer and clearer that there's something going on beyond just performance and an equalizing arena, I really hope not, because I think it will take a lot of just forgetting, a lot of obscuring, and a lot of erasure to completely go back to early Kaepernick era, or go back to like the Jordan era, where, you know, we just expected huge performances, huge platforms with no voice, right? But, you know, that is very hypothetical, and I suppose we'll see. At some point, I think gestures will have to be bigger and bigger, because that's what the NBA was so interesting. What was so interesting about the whole NBA thing is that they had been speaking, but at some point you read, you know, you have Black Lives Matter on T-shirts and all kinds of you know, statements on the back of their jerseys, and I mean, you know, at some point that stimulus stops acting, you know, on people. And they you know, they need more to remind them that there's a point being made. So it's a great you know, box to open, I think, and making it clear that those athletes can withhold labor and have an impact and get people speaking about it, and get their owners doing something about it. I don't think we can go back.
And it's definitely something that we have committed to on the Game of Stones, to continue to talk about, to continue to look at, continue to have these discussions, and you know, once things hopefully get back to normal, you know, put the weight of the show behind some more tangible things as well at you know, curling facilities across the country. So I agree, it's definitely something that is going to continue to be front of mind. So Ornella, thank you so much for this discussion. I really enjoyed this.
It was great. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the rest of the roundtable, and you know, what the other guests will be speaking about.
Yeah. So we'll continue to do them. We're gonna keep posting on Facebook and Twitter. Follow us along. Whenever we do another one, we'll give advance notice so you can follow along. So Ornella Nzindukiyimana, thank you so much for joining me, especially when it's an hour ahead. So, you know, you're later in the day than I am. So thank you so much for doing this.
No worries. Thank you.